You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and Verna Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Somebody there?
Hello, once again, to another journey into the unexplored, the unexplained Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
Verna Wilson.
And we have another nun story this week, don't we, Verna?
Yes, and the story has to do with dishonesty, forgery, and murder.
The Black Nun.
Something you would typically associate, right?
Yep, the
Yeah.
Black Nun of Threadneedle Street.
Yep.
All right. So,
Yeah.
not that I have any nun stories to share. I mean, we've told like Borley Rectory. We talked about nuns, and we've talked about nuns in the past with different shows as well.
For different story,
Yeah.
paranormal stories that had to do with nuns.
Yep, but this one's a little different.
It's a little different, yeah. And you don't have any personal nun stories, do you?
Well, I used to, when I was in grade school, I was in a Catholic school that had nuns, but nobody dressed like nuns, really.
They all just sort of dressed normal and
Yeah, in the
wore
70s,
their veils.
Yeah, and in the 70s, they didn't have veils, most of them. They just had, a couple did, but most of them were just normal jeans or corduroys and blouses. And
Well, that's interesting. Well, I actually have a nun story too, but yeah.
You have nun stories, or you do have a nun story?
No, I have nun stories. I mean, with real nuns.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not a very happy story, but it was a very nice story.
Share.
Oh, okay. Well, back in the early, something I don't like to admit or talk about, but back in my early 20s, my sister and I were homeless for a while.
That was in the 40s, right?
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. A long time ago, folks.
Way long.
We were actually homeless for a while, and this was...
How old were you? What are you guys?
In our early 20s.
Okay.
Yeah. And we actually were taken in by a shelter that was run by nuns. And you were only supposed to stay there for a certain amount of time, but these nuns wanted to help us so much that they extended our time. And they told my sister and I that they would pray for us every single day to get a home. And when my sister and I were coming back from the social services office one day, we ran across an old friend, and that very day on the street, she offered us a home, and she told us not to pay rent until we got jobs.
Wow, so it worked.
It worked.
Even with Linda, it still worked.
What is it?
Even with Linda, it still worked.
Even with Linda, it still worked, and Linda and I tried to make it work. We didn't stay there for very long, but we did end up having a place, and yeah, it went really. And I've always wanted to find out if they still run that shelter.
Yeah.
And I told myself if I ever had an extra amount of money, I would like to donate to it because they helped me. That's my story.
Nothing paranormal happened during this experience?
You know, it was an old building. I remember that. And I remember feeling the place was a little... It was actually not an old building. It was an old house, an old Victorian house where they had the shelter.
I wonder if did they own it originally, or was it something that the church would have bought?
I think it was something the church got for them.
Oh, okay.
But I felt energy in the place, but I was in my early 20s and I was too busy worrying about what's going to happen with me that I didn't.
No vampire nuns under the bed, or
No, that I didn't. That even if a ghost came up and said boo, I probably wouldn't have noticed because I was too worried at the time.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, there you go, folks. There's Verna's nun story.
My nun story. Not as dramatic, not like yours, but nevertheless, it's a nun story.
All right. So let's move forward with the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street.
Yeah. Well, this before we actually talk about the actual story, let's go into how forgery was dealt with in the 18th and 19th century. Forgery was listed under the category of deception, and that also included bankruptcy, fraud, perjury, and a miscellaneous section which included the illegal procurement of documents such as marriage licenses and the unlawful insertion of names into registers. So it was all under the same category. And in England, the offense of forgery was considered as serious as murder, and it was treated with the same consequences. And although the early records of the Old Bailey show that many of those convicted of forgery were punished with the pillory and fines, later known as the bloody code legislation, it was implemented more, and more people were sent to the gallows than not.
Yikes.
Yeah, which was, pretty awful. So anyway, the earliest cases from the Old Bailey records show that the pillory was initially the punishment of choice for most judges. I guess they were reluctant to murder people. And for example, in May 1689, a John Ingham, he was indicted for forging the signatures of 2 justices of the peace. His aim was to obtain the release of an Edward Williams from Newgate. So he was sentenced to spend 3 days in the pillory. The first day was at Hicks Hall, the second at Temple Bar, and the third at Westminster Hall Gate, as well as finding sureties for his good behavior for 12 months. So one of the reasons that forgery came to be known as a really awful crime was that with the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694, the English financial system became dependent on paper credit. So any attempt to fraudulently copy or counterfeit documents such as stamps or bonds were perceived as an attack on the very foundations on which England stood.
That would really mess with their economy, I would think.
Right,
too.
it was messing with the
If
economy.
you're entirely reliable on paper debt, then that would have a big impact.
That's
on
right,
the economy.
yeah. So in the 1820s, forgery, along with arson at the Royal Docks, treason, murder, piracy, and burglary, were one of the last offenses which carried a capital sentence. And in 1832, forgery, with the exception of the forgery of wills and certain powers of attorney, was taken off that list by a parliamentary act. And eventually in 1837, all forms of forgery were exempt. So let's go back to 1811, and we're going to go to the case of Sarah Whitehead, who was known as the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street, and this is where our story begins. So,
Okay, so one of the most famous hauntings in London is this story. It's the ghost of Sarah Whitehead, otherwise known as the Black Nun. Now, Sarah's tale begins, as you said, in 1811. When her brother Phillip was a disgruntled former clerk in the cashier's office of the Bank of England. He was found guilty of forgery and attempting to fraud the bank. And on the day of the trial, Sarah's friends worried about her reaction, and they kept the news of his conviction from her by persuading her to leave the rooms which she shared with her brother and go with them to their house off of Fleet Street. Very small street, by the way. When her brother failed to return home, Sarah tried to find him. Either her brother had never told her he had left the bank, or she had nowhere else to look since she kept going back to the bank in a desperate hope that someone would have heard from him. And eventually, either out of annoyance or pity, one of the clerks finally blurted out the truth. The shock destroyed her mind. On her death, she was believed to have been buried close to the Bank of England on the former site of St. Christopher le Stocks, which was demolished in 1781. When the premises of the bank was extended, the former graveyard became the gardens of the bank. Now, there are different accounts of what happened after Sarah finally told the truth. One version is she visited the bank every day for the remainder of her 25 years, asking politely for her brother, whilst another that on her visits she was verbally abusive to the bank staff, and a third recounts how she became convinced that the bank had stolen money from her and would demand that they return what they had taken. Eventually, in 1818, the bank's governors, tired of her constant presence, gave her a sum of money on the provision that she would never come back, a promise that she kept.
Now, even though the details of the story vary slightly, the one thing that they all agree on is Sarah's appearance. For the rest of her life, she always wore full mourning weeds, which consisted of a long black gown and a full black veil. So, over the next 200 years, Sarah's spirit was unable to rest. She'd been seen at the Bank of England itself, at Bank Station, where the railway staff, they recall that she leaves behind a really morbid feeling of sorrow and hopelessness. They said, that negative energy she leaves behind. And in the former graveyard of the church where she was originally buried, the witnesses claimed to have seen her in the garden. They said that she walks hesitantly, groping her way along as if she's blind, and then she falls to her knees and beats the ground with her fists. And she's crying and shaking violently, and then all of a sudden she vanishes. So she's most seen often at night wandering the streets around the bank, and in particular Threadneedle Street, still intent on finding her brother. She's been seen by numerous people, some who know the legend, most who don't. People of all ages, beliefs and lifestyles, people alone or with other people. They've claimed to have seen a woman dressed in black, walking slowly along the road, and it's usually her strange attire which first gets their attention. Sometimes she stops them, and with eyes downcast, she asks politely about her brother, and then receiving a negative answer, she turns and walks away, disappearing from sight. And some people, seeing her walk past, are overcome by a feeling of intense grief and sadness, and they approach her asking her if she needs help. And she just turns around and asks her constant question, have you seen my brother?
Now, when looking at different websites and accounts for the Black Nun, most of them list Sarah's brother's name as Phillip. And on other websites, there is no record of Philip Whitehead appearing in the Old Bailey. Now, if you look through online records, there's no evidence of Philip Whitehead, but there is a Paul Whitehead, age 36, who was convicted of forgery and sentenced to be hanged. Now, looking at the proceedings of the trial, certain details emerge which fit with the legend surrounding Sarah Whitehead, including the date of the trial, October 30th, 1811, and the fact that Whitehead was a former clerk in the cashier's office at the Bank of England. The transcript from the trial records that Whitehead was indicted on 6 counts of forgery, the main charge being for feloniously forging and counterfeiting an acceptance on a certain bill of exchange for £871. It's hard to tell. Intention to defraud. Now, Whitehead was hanged at Newgate on the January 29th, 1812, in front of a large crowd. He was described as being of genteel appearance, and who, together with the 5 other condemned men, met their fate with decent fortitude, and when on the fatal scaffold shook hands, after which they were launched into eternity. Now, maybe Paul Whitehead is not Philip Whitehead, but he isn't then why there's no record of any of trials, or maybe the legend of Sarah has been fabricated based on his crime and death. Personally, it could be a mistake in that Philip is Paul Whitehead, and the story is historically with Sarah is true. You never know. Maybe one day they'll be reunited with brother and sister, gain peace of mind, and she won't have to search anymore. You know what's interesting about Newgate? Is I don't remember what I was watching. It could be something I read too. I don't remember.
Sure.
Newgate Prison. They tore everything above ground down in like the 1782 or something, and they built a school on top of the grounds.
Oh, that's interesting.
Now, interestingly enough, below ground are the lower catacomb prison cells that remained.
Crazy.
And those prison cells still exist today, those catacomb prison cells. And up until I think the late 80s, tourists were able to have tours to go down and go through them.
Wow.
And they had paranormal groups were able to go down there, even into the 90s.
Oh, wow.
And suddenly, they closed the school, and they turned the school into condos. And so the new owners of the condos locked off the Newgate catacomb cells and wouldn't let anybody for any reason down there anymore.
Oh, wow.
So it's sad because I would love to have just take one of those paranormal trips down there or a
Why
tour.
did they close them off? I mean,
Probably insurance liabilities, because if you have condos, if someone wandered down there and got hurt and you didn't close it off.
so it was okay for the school, but not for the condos?
Well, because they didn't own it then.
Oh, they didn't own it, right.
The school
yeah.
had closed and they bought the property and
Right.
converted the school into condos, but they had that underground liability that if someone got hurt from somebody on the property, you could get sued, which is
That's
probably
true.
why they shut them and locked them up.
Yeah.
It's just sad because that's a piece of history that still exists. At least it still exists. They didn't gut it. They didn't do anything. They just locked the door and nobody can go down there.
It would be cool if they would at least get permission and let one group, with special permission go. But I guess
Yeah.
I guess you have to go through some channels to do that.
Exactly. So I was desperately looking online to see if there were any tours, and I
Oh,
found a site
man.
that said, "Sorry, we can no longer give tours to the Newgate catacomb cells." And
Well, even before the catacomb cells, the fact that it's on the very site where Newgate was, and there was a school there, can you imagine the energy that these kids and people might have felt at the time? And maybe even the residents may
I was going
feel.
to say the people that own the condos now, you got to remember, yeah, exactly. What kind of things happen with the school? It'd be interesting to go back in the articles and find out if
they-
the school had any sightings or paranormal experiences.
Yeah.
And then after this condo, this condo's been around now for, I guess, 20, 25 years now.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So
Yeah, for a while.
Somebody's got to have stories in 25 years. I don't know.
Well, any listeners in London who know about this?
That's right.
Yeah, tell us.
But I was fascinated and disappointed that I couldn't have access because I was ready to, next time I go there, to set up a tour and go down there, and I'm like, oh, it's locked up. Nobody can go down there now. Oh.
Yeah.
So I know that's way off topic, but since he was hung in that prison, I guess it sort of ties in.
Well, it's not totally off topic, but
Now you got the history of what happened to the prison.
right. No, that's good to know. About the story itself. If it was really her brother, this Paul Whitehead, and that's interesting that there was an actual brother that was accused of forgery who did work in that bank.
Yeah.
An actual case, they found it. They're allowed in prison to say goodbye to their family. They're allowed to tell their family. So why couldn't he get somebody to tell his sister, listen, something happened to me?
Well, we got to think this is all hearsay. They don't know for sure if those two that were found.
No, I mean, if it was.
If it was.
Yeah.
We don't know that it
Something odd
wasn't.
about
We
that.
don't know that it really wasn't. Nobody around will really know because it was so long ago.
Oh, I know, but I'm just saying that for the standard, I
But
mean,
doesn't that sound like a much better ghost story? A woman who's endlessly looking for her brother to tell him or to find him?
it does, but
Conveniently.
it also could have been, it was like maybe a few incidents and she was getting to be a hassle and it turned into a ghost story because you know how something happens and then people pass along the story and all of a sudden it gets embellished. She could have wondered what happened to her brother because, I mean, women were very sheltered back then and she maybe didn't go out a lot and she probably didn't hear about the news but then if he's in prison, tell my sister, this is what's happening with me.
What I don't understand is if she knew, why wasn't she? Well, I guess because I was reading about Newgate and their hangings.
Yeah.
They for years they were public because that's what the public enjoyed
Yeah,
was to
it was a
watch
very
hangings.
public event, yeah.
But Newgate eventually moved them indoors where they weren't public anymore.
Oh, wow, okay.
And this might have been when they were still public. Maybe they weren't at this point, and that's why his sister wasn't there.
Oh, that's true. That's true as well. You would have thought, though, that other people would inform his sister. I mean, it just seems weird that a member of your family who you live with doesn't know. But
Now that I think about it, I was just before we started the show, I was telling Verna about there's a bar called the Black Monks Pub or Black Monks Bar.
Yeah.
It's a small little bar that was an old monks building, and next to a monastery. The monastery's long gone. You know what was across the street was Newgate.
oh yeah,
That's where Newgate was,
Oh,
right next to it, because that's right down the
right.
street from Fleet Street. So it's interesting because now people still see monks, ghosts, and shadow figures at the pub, even though the monastery's gone. But we were walked down the street and we were told about Newgate Prison, and they pointed to where it was, the block across the street.
Well, who knows if it's monks? I mean, you could be seeing former prisoners or former people who hanged,
or her. She could have been
her.
wandering
Could have been
around.
her too. Yeah, but I mean, there's not many stories where somebody walks in. I mean, I can imagine the bank is all busy with their staff, their clerks, and everything, and all of a sudden, the sister of their murdered staff member comes in and said, "Where's my brother?" And they all look at her like, "What?
Was
Doesn't
that a ghost
she know?"
or mental illness? Do you know what I
Right.
mean?
No, yeah, I know. I
While
understand.
she was still alive,
While
was
she was
that
still
mental
alive, they
illness?
probably, I mean, I can imagine the odd
Yeah.
looks she got in the
Oh,
atmosphere.
yeah.
And can you imagine
Oh, my
the
God.
tension in the air thinking, doesn't she know?
Well, the staff were like, "Oh my God, she's back! Don't look at her! Don't give her attention. Maybe she'll leave. Oh my God, she's in your line. Oh my God, good luck."
Yeah, and she was probably so persistent, they finally decided to tell her, listen, this is what happened to your brother.
Yeah,
And
your brother's gone.
yeah, and she probably was, she if she didn't know, I can imagine freaking if I don't know. But the first people I would be pissed off is my friends and the people who knew my brother and said, why didn't you say something to me?
Now let's think about through a haunting perspective.
Okay.
I don't. It's not residual only because she interacts with people sometimes. She asks them the question, "Have you seen my brother?" And they say no, or they feel the sadness, and she moves on. That's interactive. That's not residual. Residual
Right.
doesn't talk to you and you talk back.
Right. They're kind of going about their business that
She's
they've always
almost
done.
stuck in an emotional loop.
She's stuck in trauma.
Yeah, she's still
Yeah.
trying to sort through this devastation of her brother being completely out of her life and gone. So somewhere along the line she passed away, but her going to the bank every day or every week or whatever and asking for her brother.
Until they paid her off.
So maybe she was still alive when she went to the bank and it wasn't a ghost, but she continued to go back as a ghost.
Yeah, and then they paid her off, and then they never saw her again.
Yeah.
But what was she doing all that time?
Or she passed away after they paid her off. You never know.
That's true too. Yeah. Apparently, she lived for a while after this happened when they paid her off.
See, but that's why I'm thinking if she was so devastated that she did all that, even if she was alive and paid off, if she was mentally incapacitated and so obsessed with her brother and this whole ordeal, she wouldn't just drop it. She would continually wander around looking for her brother, wonder why her brother doesn't come back home, where is he, until she does die. And then maybe, who knows, maybe she still was wandering around the same streets looking for her brother, and they see her for a minute and then she's gone.
Well, here's another version of this story. She became known as the bank nun. And of course, she was known for her attire, known for wearing black. Apparently, the city merchants, they took pity on her, and they never let her pass without extending their assistance. Because, a woman just lost her brother, she's in mourning, they felt sorry for her.
Yeah.
So the directors and the Bank of England saw to it that she was frequently provided with sums of money in compliment of her misfortune. They wanted to assist her, probably give donations.
Yep, I'm sure.
But she became convinced that the bank governors were keeping an immense fortune from her, and this led her to frequently hurling insults at them during business
that's
hours.
mental illness. That's complete mental illness at that point.
Yeah, because, wouldn't you hire a lawyer saying, can you look into my affairs, rather than going in and hiring and saying, you're keeping money from me and being verbally
that's just
abusive?
Someone who lost their relative and is just mentally incapacitated.
Yeah.
She shouldn't be on the streets. They should have probably put her somewhere
To get help.
But in those
Yeah.
days, they would have thrown her in a place like Newgate because she was mentally ill.
Right,
Or an asylum.
Or an asylum, yeah. And they said that one occasion, Baron Rothschild was going about his business at the stock exchange when she suddenly appeared and called him a villain and a robber, telling him that he defrauded her of her fortune and demanded £2,000 that he owed her. And he responded by taking half a crown from his waistcoat pocket and handing it over to her, telling her as he did so, "There, now take that and don't bother me. I'll give you the other half tomorrow." And accepting the money, she thanked him and went away.
See, that's mental illness.
That's mental illness, so she was probably mentally ill, yeah.
And she probably, like I said, she probably went every day the same round, the same time, into the same bank, and everybody at the bank knew who she was. She's those regular customers that are just, oh God, here comes
Here
so-and-so.
she comes again.
Yeah, everybody's had customers like that. If you've worked at a job or
Oh, yeah.
in the service industry or customer service.
Yeah.
There's like, oh my God, there's Mr. So-and-so. Oh God, please don't come to my line. Hi.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that when she died, she was buried not so far from that place.
Well,
But there's a lot of...
But it's funny reading about the area, and it's interesting, up the street from Newgate and this monk pub
Sure.
was the starting point of the Great Fire of London.
Oh, I thought the Great Fire came before that.
No? Well, I'm saying it did, but I'm saying the location of where
the
it started
location,
is
right.
up the street.
Okay.
It's very walkable. And down there in that part of London, you can walk around all over down there.
Oh, wow, okay.
And that's one of these trips, that's what I kind of want to do for a day, is just walk around.
Sure, I'm sure you can find a lot of little places that the tourists don't normally go to. Or
Yeah, I mean, London's ripping out and gutting a lot of buildings. They're leaving the facades and gutting the buildings, which is kind of sad.
Yeah,
But I guess historically they're supposed to leave the facades
right.
to give it the character and the architecture. But there's a lot of stories around. I mean, even St. Peter's Cathedral has a lot of stories, and they were telling us some of the paranormal stories around there. And of course, that's the famous St. Paul's Cathedral. I meant the same steps that the bird woman in Mary Poppins feeds the birds. That's the steps.
Right.
But there's all the saints and stuff that are buried inside in the mausoleum down in the basement of the church.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
We couldn't go in the church because there was a wedding.
Oh,
so
yeah.
we went down into the basement where all the mausoleums were, the gift shops down there.
Oh, wow.
But it's an interesting area, part of London that, like you said, there's all kinds of historic things to find. But
Sure.
everybody has ghost stories in London, for sure.
I wonder if the bank the bank probably thought they had better things to document, but if they even documented or talked about it, or if this story was strictly word of mouth.
I'm sure back then, for this woman coming in and out of the bank,
They didn't think anything to talk about.
But as a business, why would you document it?
Yeah, she wasn't
What's
a
the
customer.
point?
They didn't have any records on, any records, except for if she had a brother, he worked there. That was the closest records they had about them.
He had 8 counts of forgery. Of course, they're going to have him in their records.
They're going to have him,
But unless she had a bank account, she'd never be in the records.
she would never be in the records.
She just came in demanding money. She's this Looney Tunes lady that comes in every day.
Yeah, we don't document our Looney Tunes out here, so
There you go.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that if people still see her wandering around. So
It's interesting and it's sad, actually.
it is. And I don't know if you can do an investigation. It's so noisy even at night in London that I don't think you could ever do a proper one. Unless you set up cameras 24 hours a day across the street,
Maybe.
aimed at the bank, and just check your footage every couple of days.
Or unless there's a corner, a little corner or a little niche around there where she might be frequenting and there's not a lot of people and you can go in that niche and kind of sit.
Way too many people down there.
Yeah, forget it. It's just an idea.
It's like going on Market Street in the middle of the day and saying, this is a quiet spot.
That's true.
Especially lower market towards the ferry
I'm sure you
building.
could find them, but you really have to work hard.
Yep. But, a ghost story is still interesting. And,
Yeah, it is.
What there is beneath London is, a lot of it's still there. People just don't know where to find it.
Right.
So that Newgate tie-in interested me. But that's an interesting story. Another crazy... now, why is it called the Black Nun, though? Why is she a nun, or is that just the name they gave her?
I think that's just the name they gave her because she was all in black and...
She moved like a nun because she was in black?
Well, because she was black attire, like wearing mourning weeds. But maybe, I don't know, I know this is stereotyping, but she was a single woman too.
Yeah.
Not an unmarried woman. And, you know how they always say, oh, there's, they live like nuns, it's a stereotype. I don't like it either.
She's a spinster nun.
She's a spinster nun, it's a stereotype. But
it's just interesting that they would call her a black nun.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because they see a shadow figure and disappears.
Or the veil that she wears.
So they called her. Some people probably called her a nun. Some people just said it was a woman
I hope
in
it's
black.
because of her attire, not because of her status. But, back then,
You never know.
that's what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, there's definitely pencil ink drawings of her as the nun. So
Yeah, that's interesting because the ink drawing, I wonder if it came from somebody who saw her when she was still alive and they still have a drawing of what she looked like, or it was
could have been people at the bank described them to the press.
Yeah, could have been. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
I think it's
interesting.
cool that a drawing from that time still exists.
Yep, I
Yeah.
agree. All right, there you go, folks. Another ghost story of a nun, sort of. She's
Sort of.
nun light.
Yeah.
And that's another one for the books. Interesting. Another interesting London ghost story.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Till next week, we're going to say goodbye.
Yeah, see you next week. Bye.
Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Kevin MacLeod and Ross Bugden.